The city of Chicago wept in 1925. Rain fell in relentless silver sheets, turning the cobblestones of Wabash Avenue into a dark, shimmering mirror that reflected the city's electric dreams and its grimy realities. For Eleanor Vance, the world outside the plate-glass window of the Quillen Chronicle bookstore was a watercolor painting left out in a storm, its vibrant colors bleeding into a melancholic gray. Inside, however, was her sanctuary. The scent of aging paper, leather bindings, and fresh ink was the only perfume she cared for. It was a fragrance of order, of stories neatly contained between two covers, where chaos had a beginning, a middle, and a definitive end. At 24, Eleanor's life was much like the books she so lovingly curated, quiet, predictable, and lived more through the experiences of others than her own. Her mousy brown hair was always pinned in a neat chignon. Her dresses were modest affairs of navy and charcoal, a stark contrast to the daring, knee-length frocks and cloche hats worn by the flappers who sometimes drifted into the shop, their laughter like the bright, jarring notes of a jazz trumpet in a hushed library. She observed them with a distant curiosity, these creatures of the new age, but felt no desire to join their frenetic dance. Her adventures were bound in vellum and cloth, her passions penned by authors long since turned to dust. Tonight, the storm had driven away the last of the customers. The bell above the door had fallen silent, and the only sounds were the rhythmic drumming of rain against the glass and the soft rustle of pages as she completed the final inventory. A glance at the handsome regulator clock on the wall told her it was well past 9. A sigh escaped her lips. She was tired, a bone-deep weariness that came from a day spent on her feet and a life spent in the quiet margins. All she wanted was the solace of her small apartment, a cup of hot tea, and the company of Mr. Dickens. Securing the heavy oak door with a turn of the brass key, Eleanor pulled the collar of her wool coat tighter around her neck and opened her umbrella. The wind immediately tried to snatch it from her grasp, a mischievous city sprite tugging at the fabric. The street was nearly deserted. The headlights of a passing Ford Model T cut through the gloom, illuminating the downpour for a fleeting moment before plunging the world back into shades of black and gray. Her usual route home was a 10-minute walk, but tonight, with the wind howling and the rain soaking the hem of her coat, it felt like a voyage across a tumultuous sea. Then she saw it, the narrow alleyway that cut between the bookstore and the adjacent tailor's shop. A shortcut. She rarely used it, preferring the well-lit avenues, but they thought of being home, dry and safe, a few minutes sooner, was an irresistible lure. It was a foolish, impulsive decision, the kind her fictional heroines often made right before their lives unraveled. With a shiver that had little to do with the cold, Eleanor folded her umbrella, held her breath, and plunged into the darkness. The alley was a canyon of brick and shadow, smelling of damp refuse and coal smoke. The roar of the city was muffled here, replaced by the gurgle of water rushing through a drain pipe and the drip, drip, drip from an overhanging fire escape. It was a place between places, a secret vein running through the heart of Chicago. She took a few hesitant steps, her sensible shoes splashing in unseen puddles. The only light was a single bare bulb high above a service door, casting a sickly yellow glow that made the shadows writhe and dance. It was in that jaundiced light that she saw them. 2 men. They stood near the opposite end of the alley, their forms stark silhouettes against the faintly lit street beyond. One was large and imposing, his bulk straining the seams of a dark overcoat, a fedora pulled low over his eyes. The other was tall and slender, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that even in the dim light seemed to radiate an air of effortless elegance. He stood with a calm stillness, his hands in his pockets, his posture relaxed, despite the obvious tension that crackled in the air. Eleanor froze, her back pressed hard against the cold, wet brick. She was a mouse caught between two tomcats, invisible as long as she remained perfectly still. "You've been a difficult man to find, Sterling," the larger man's voice rasped, a gravelly sound that seemed to scrape against the silence. "For a man about town, you've become quite the ghost." The elegant man, Sterling, offered a slight, almost amused smile. "Perhaps I simply grew tired of the company I was keeping." Gallo. A man is allowed to refine his tastes. The name Gallo sent a spike of pure ice through Eleanor's veins. Clarence Gallo, even a quiet book clerk like her, had heard the whispers, read the sensationalized headlines in the Tribune. Gallo was a leg breaker, an enforcer for the city's most notorious bootlegging syndicate, a man whose name was synonymous with violence. Gallo chuckled, a low, guttural sound, devoid of any humor. "Refine his tastes, that's what you call it?" Blackwood calls it betrayal. He doesn't appreciate his employees asking questions they shouldn't. Poking their noses into ledgers meant only for his eyes. Arthur Sterling tilted his head, the faint light catching the sharp line of his jaw. A man of Mr. Blackwood's stature should ensure his accounts are in order. "I was merely being a diligent associate." "You were a rat, Sterling," Gallo snarled, taking a menacing step forward. "And rats need to have their nests fumigated." Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. She should run, she should scream, but her feet were rooted to the spot, her throat constricted by a knot of paralyzing fear. This was not a story in a book. This was real. The metallic tongue of danger was sharp in the air. Sterling's composure didn't crack. He slowly withdrew a hand from his pocket, not in a gesture of aggression, but to pull a silver cigarette case from his breast pocket. He opened it with a quiet snap. "I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about," he said smoothly, his voice a low baritone that cut cleanly through the damp air. "But if Walter Blackwood has a message for me, perhaps he should have delivered it himself." "Oh, this is his message," Gallo said, and the speed with which he moved was terrifying for a man his size. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides. His right hand emerged from his coat pocket, and it was not a cigarette he held. It was a snub-nosed revolver, its dark metal absorbing the faint light. Eleanor's breath caught. A tiny, involuntary gasp escaped her lips, a sound immediately swallowed by the rain, but it was enough. For a fraction of a second, Arthur Sterling's gaze flickered away from his executioner, past Gallo's shoulder, and into the deep shadows where she hid. His eyes, she saw in that fleeting moment, were a startling shade of gray, like a winter sky, and they widened almost imperceptibly. He had seen her. He knew she was there. The knowledge was a physical blow. She was no longer just an observer. She was a part of it, a witness. Gallo, misinterpreting the flicker of Sterling's eyes as a loss of nerve, grinned cruelly. "Looking for an angel, Sterling. There are no angels in this alley." He pressed the muzzle of the gun against the fine fabric of Sterling's suit, right over his heart. Sterling's gaze remained locked on the spot where Eleanor was concealed, a silent, desperate communication she couldn't begin to comprehend. His face held no fear, only a strange, profound resignation. Eleanor squeezed her eyes shut, but she could not block out the sound. The gunshot was not a loud boom, like in the motion pictures. It was a sharp, brutal crack, a sound that ripped through the fabric of the night and echoed off the brick walls. It was followed by a heavy, sickening thud. Her eyes flew open. Arthur Sterling lay crumpled on the wet ground, his elegant form now just a heap in the rain. A dark stain was already spreading across his chest, blossoming like a morbid flower. Gallo stood over him for a moment, nudging the body with his foot, as if to confirm his work was done. He then spat on the ground, turned, and walked briskly out of the alley, disappearing into the neon-lit haze of the city. Silence descended, a profound, deafening void, filled only by the relentless drumming of the rain. Eleanor couldn't breathe. Her entire body trembled uncontrollably. She had just seen a man murdered, a man who, in his final second of life, had looked right at her. Panic finally broke through the paralysis. She had to get away. She stumbled backward, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a scream. Her other hand went to her hair, her fingers fumbling with the pins that held her chignon in place. In her frantic, clumsy movement, something small and hard came loose. It slipped through her numb fingers and fell to the ground with a soft, almost inaudible clink. Her mother-of-pearl hair comb, a gift from her late grandmother, her one small vanity. She saw it lying there, a pale crescent gleaming faintly in a puddle near the brick wall. A piece of her, a piece of evidence. Leaving it felt like leaving a part of her soul behind. But the thought of stepping further into that alley, closer to the body of the dead man, was an impossibility. With a sob of pure terror, Eleanor turned and ran. She fled the alleyway, bursting back out onto the street, into the indifferent rain. She ran without looking back, the image of Arthur Sterling's grey eyes and the sharp crack of the pistol seared into her mind. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs ached, leaving her quiet, orderly world shattered in a dark alleyway, marked only by a fallen man and a small, lost comb of mother-of-pearl. The days that followed were a torment of sleepless nights and hollow, fear-filled days. Eleanor's small apartment, once her refuge from the world, had transformed into a cage. Every creak of the floorboards in the hallway outside her door sent a jolt of panic through her. Every backfire from a passing automobile on the street below was the echo of that dreadful gunshot. The city's symphony, once a comforting backdrop to her quiet life, had become a cacophony of threats. She existed in a state of suspended terror, a fly caught in a spider's web, waiting for the predator to return. At the bookstore, she was a ghost of her former self. She moved through the familiar aisles of towering shelves with a distracted air, her fingers tracing the spines of books whose titles she could no longer register. Her employer, the kind, elderly Mr. Abernathy, noted her pallor and the dark circles under her eyes, attributing them to a seasonal malady. "You must take care of yourself, my dear Eleanor," he'd said, pressing a warm cup of herbal tea into her cold hands. She had nodded and offered a weak smile, the lie catching in her throat. How could she explain that her illness was not of the body, but of the soul, a sickness born from a secret she could never share? 2 days after the incident, the news broke. It was there in bold, stark letters on the front page of the Chicago Tribune, nestled beside a story about rising stock prices and another on the latest efforts of the Prohibition Bureau. Prominent socialite Arthur Sterling vanishes, foul play suspected. Eleanor's hands trembled so violently she nearly dropped the newspaper. She read the article in snatched, feverish glances, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Arthur Sterling, the charming scion of an old money family, a man known for his wit, his impeccable taste, and his regular presence at the city's most exclusive jazz clubs and speakeasies, had disappeared. He was last seen leaving a dinner party 2 nights prior. His hat had been found near a service alley off Wabash Avenue. The police, the article stated, were investigating but had no leads. Friends and associates were quoted, expressing their shock and dismay. They called him a gentleman, a man of leisure, a man without enemies. Eleanor knew better. She knew who his enemy was. A wave of nausea and a strange conflicting sense of relief washed over her. He was gone. The world believed him to be the victim of some terrible, random act of violence, or perhaps a kidnapping gone wrong. They didn't know the truth. They weren't looking for a witness. For a brief, selfish moment, she felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps she was safe. Perhaps, Clarence Gallows' brutal act would be buried under the weight of 1,000 other city crimes, and she could slowly, carefully piece her shattered piece back together. But the relief was quickly consumed by a thick, cloying guilt. A man was dead, murdered before her very eyes, and she had done nothing. She had run. She hadn't called the police. Her silence made her an accomplice, a silent partner to a killer. The weight of that knowledge pressed down on her, making it hard to breathe. The face of Arthur Sterling, his cool grey eyes widening in his final moment of life, was imprinted on the back of her eyelids. He had seen her. Had he been trying to tell her something, pleading for help? Or was it an accusation? That night the storm returned, a pale imitation of the first, a gentle patter against her window panes. But for Eleanor, it was enough. The sound transported her back to the alley, to the smell of rain and decay, to the sound that had ripped her life in two. Sleep was an impossibility. She sat wrapped in a heavy quilt in her worn armchair, a book lying open and unread in her lap, staring into the darkened room. The hands on her mantel clock ticked with agonizing slowness, each second a drop of water in an endless torture. It was sometime after midnight when she heard it, a sound from within her own apartment. Not the familiar groan of the building settling or the sigh of the old steam pipes. It was a soft, deliberate sound from the corner of the room, near the window she always left slightly ajar for the fresh night air. The scrape of a leather shoe against the hardwood floor. Her blood ran cold. Every muscle in her body clucked, her breath catching in her throat. She wasn't alone. He had found her, Gallo, or one of his men. They had found the one loose end, the silent witness. The newspaper in her mind screamed a new headline: "Book clerk found dead. Connection to Sterling case." Her imagination, usually a source of comfort and escape, now became her most vicious tormentor. Slowly, her eyes straining in the gloom, she peered into the shadows pooling by the window. A figure began to resolve itself from the darkness, a tall, slender shape, detaching itself from the deeper black of the night. It moved with a quiet, fluid grace that was unnervingly familiar. The moonlight, filtering through the rain-streaked glass, caught the edge of a face, illuminating a sharp jawline and a straight nose. Eleanor's heart stopped. A scream built in her chest, a primal sound of utter terror and disbelief, but it died before it could reach her lips, strangled by sheer shock. It wasn't Gallo. It wasn't a nameless thug. It was Arthur Sterling. He was no ghost, no figment of her guilt-ridden imagination. He was solid, real, and standing less than 10 feet away from her. He looked different than she remembered from the alley. His impeccable suit was gone, replaced by a simple dark shirt and trousers. His face was leaner, the handsome features sharpened by exhaustion, and shadows clung beneath his eyes. But they were the same eyes, the same startling shade of a winter sky. "Please," he said, his voice a low, urgent whisper, raising a hand as if to calm a frightened animal. "Don't scream." Eleanor could only stare, her mind reeling, struggling to reconcile the impossible reality before her with the memory of his body, lying broken on the wet cobblestones. Was she losing her mind? Had the fear finally fractured her sanity? "You are dead," she managed to whisper, the words barely audible. "I saw you. I saw." "What you saw was a performance, Miss Vance," he said, taking a slow, deliberate step forward. He moved with a slight limp she hadn't noticed before. "A rather convincing one, I'll admit, but a performance nonetheless." He stopped, keeping a respectful distance. He reached into his pocket and slowly drew something out. He held it in his open palm, and the moonlight caught it, making it gleam with a soft, milky luminescence. Her mother-of-pearl hair comb. The sight of it, lying in the palm of this impossible man's hand, was more shocking than seeing him alive. It was the proof, tangible link between her world and his. "You dropped this," he said, his voice quiet but intense. "In your haste to leave, it took me 2 days to find out who it belonged to. You have a discerning taste, Miss Vance. There's only one shop in Chicago that imports this particular style from France." Eleanor couldn't speak. Her mind was a whirlwind of questions, none of which she could form into a coherent thought. As if reading her mind, he began to explain, his words clipped and precise. "Gallo was meant to kill me that night. Or at least, the world was meant to believe he did. The gunshot was real, but the bullet was a blank. The blood, well, some tricks of the trade are best left unexamined. It was all a charade, my only way out of what?" She breathed, finding her voice at last. A flicker of something dark and dangerous crossed his face, a business arrangement that had turned unhealthy. "I knew they were coming for me. I simply arranged the time and place of my own execution. It was the only way to disappear completely, to become a ghost." He paused, his grey eyes locking onto hers, and their expression was no longer calm. It was deadly serious. "And then you were there. You were the one thing I hadn't planned for. The only witness to a death that never happened." The pieces began to click into place, forming a picture far more terrifying than a simple murder. He hadn't just been a victim, he had been a player in a game she couldn't begin to comprehend. "I had to find you," he continued, his voice dropping even lower. "Gallo and his employer, Walter Blackwood, are not men who leave things to chance. If they ever discovered that someone else was in that alley, they would stop at nothing to silence you permanently." He took another step closer, the space between them shrinking, charged with a tension that was thick and suffocating. Eleanor could smell the faint scent of the rain on his coat, of damp wool, and something else, something uniquely him, a clean, masculine scent of cedar and resolve. "I am in hiding, Miss Vance. My life depends on the world continuing to believe that I am dead. Your presence in that alley makes you the single greatest threat to my existence." His eyes held hers, and she felt pinned by their intensity, a butterfly under glass. "And my presence here, in your apartment, makes me the only thing standing between you and the men who would kill you to protect their secrets." The fear she had been living with for days suddenly felt small, provincial, compared to the vast and lethal reality he was laying out before her. The ghost of midnight was real, and he hadn't come to haunt her. He had come because, in a world of shadows and lies, she was a liability he couldn't afford. "You and I, Miss Vance," Arthur Sterling said, his voice leaving no room for argument, "are now bound by the same secret. And if that secret is ever revealed, we will share the same fate." He was a ghost made of flesh and blood, a living contradiction standing in the center of her small, orderly world. For a long moment, Eleanor could do nothing but stare, her mind struggling to build a bridge between the man she saw murdered and the man who now stood before her, holding a piece of her past in his hand. His explanation, as fantastic as it was, settled into the silence with the cold, heavy weight of truth. This was not madness. This was something far more dangerous. "Blackwood," she repeated the name, the word feeling foreign and ugly on her tongue. "The man from the papers. The philanthropist." A humorless smile touched Arthur's lips. "On the front page, he's a philanthropist, a man of civic duty. In the back alleys, he's an emperor. He runs more than just speakeasies, Miss Vance. He runs this city's entire shadow economy, bootlegged liquor, gambling, extortion. Anything that thrives in the dark, Walter Blackwood owns it." He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush. "And for the past year, I have been his trusted right hand." The confession hung in the air between them. Eleanor looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw past the elegant socialite. She saw the tension in his shoulders, the weariness in his eyes that spoke of a man living on a knife's edge. He wasn't just a part of that world, he had been immersed in it. "Why?" she asked, the question a genuine burning curiosity that momentarily eclipsed her fear. "Because it was my job," he said simply. "I wasn't working for Blackwood. I was working for the Treasury Department. My task was to map his entire operation from the inside, his suppliers, his distribution networks, the politicians on his payroll. I was gathering enough evidence to dismantle his empire from top to bottom." He ran a hand through his dark hair, a gesture of profound frustration. But someone on the inside tipped him off. He grew suspicious. The walls were closing in. The assassination was my only way to get out with the information I had, and, more importantly, with my life. Suddenly, her role in this deadly play became terrifyingly clear. "And me," she whispered, "if he finds out you're alive, he'll know someone helped me. Or at the very least, that the story has a loose end." Arthur finished for her. "Blackwood doesn't tolerate loose ends. He snips them. Your quiet, predictable life, Miss Vance, ended the moment you stepped into that alley. I am truly sorry for that, but apologies won't keep you safe." He looked around her small, cozy apartment at the stacks of books, the faded floral armchair, the framed print of a tranquil countryside scene. It was the home of a woman who had never known real danger. "You can't stay here," he stated, his tone shifting from explanation to command. "They found your comb. They know someone was there. It's only a matter of time before they connect it to the shops in this area, to you. We have to go now." The finality in his voice shattered the last vestiges of her disbelief. This was real. The life she had known was over. Her old life was a book she had finished reading, and the cover was now closed forever. There was no going back to the previous page. A strange calm settled over her. The terror was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now overlaid with a sense of inevitability. She looked at Arthur Sterling, this enigmatic stranger who had walked out of the grave and into her living room. He was right. He was her only protector, because he was the only one who understood the threat. "What do you need me to do?" she asked, her voice steadier than she could have hoped. For the first time, a flicker of genuine surprise, perhaps even respect, showed in his gray eyes. "I need you to trust me," he said, "and I need you to be invisible. Pack a small bag. Only the essentials. Nothing sentimental, nothing that can be traced. We have to leave this place as if you've simply vanished." While Eleanor moved with numb efficiency, pulling a simple dress, toiletries, and a spare pair of stockings into a small valise, Arthur moved through the apartment like a phantom. He wiped down the doorknobs, the surface of the table where he had placed her comb, even the windowsill where he had entered. He was erasing himself, and by extension, her. He worked with a quiet, focused intensity that was both mesmerizing and chilling. He was a man accustomed to living in the shadows. 10 minutes later, they slipped out of her apartment building and into the deserted, rain-slicked streets. The city was asleep, its roaring voice reduced to a low hum. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every darkened window seemed to hide a pair of watching eyes. Arthur led her through a labyrinth of back streets to a parked Ford sedan, a plain, unremarkable vehicle that blended in with the night. He opened the passenger door for her, a gesture of ingrained courtesy that seemed absurdly out of place given their desperate circumstances. They drove in silence through the sleeping city, the rhythmic sweep of the windscreen wipers, counting out the seconds of her new life. He drove with an easy confidence, his eyes constantly scanning the streets, the mirrors, his hands resting lightly on the wheel. Eleanor watched his profile, silhouetted against the passing streetlights. Who was this man really? He was more than a spy, more than a socialite. He was a puzzle, and she was now inextricably part of his design. He finally pulled into a quiet, narrow street in a neighborhood of old brick buildings and workshops. He parked in front of a small, dark shopfront. A faded, hand-painted sign above the door read, H. Grimsby and Sons, Chronometers and Horology, a clockmaker's shop. "Where are we?" she whispered. "Someplace no one would ever look for a man like me," he replied, "killing the engine. Or a woman like you. Wait here." He got out and disappeared into the shadows of the shop's recessed doorway. A moment later a faint light appeared in the window, and he beckoned her to follow. Inside, the air smelled of oil, old wood, and brass. The room was filled with clocks of every shape and size, grandfather clocks standing like silent sentinels, mantel clocks with ornate carvings, and wall clocks whose pendulums were frozen in mid-swing. The only sound was the soft, steady ticking of a single massive regulator clock against the far wall. It felt like they had stepped into the very heart of time itself. Arthur walked directly to a towering grandfather clock in the corner of the room. He didn't wind it or check its face. Instead, he ran his hand along its carved wooden side, pressing a spot that looked no different from the rest. There was a low, mechanical click, and the entire clock swung inward, revealing not a wall, but a dark, narrow opening. "After you, Miss Vance," he said softly. Hesitantly, Eleanor stepped through the opening into a short, dark hallway. Arthur followed, pulling the clock shut behind them. It closed with a solid, definitive thud, plunging them into absolute blackness before he flicked a switch, revealing a steep staircase. At the top was a door, which opened into a small, sparsely furnished apartment. It was clean but Spartan. A narrow bed was tucked into one corner. A small table with 2 chairs stood in the center, and a tiny kitchenette lined one wall. A single grimy window looked out onto the brick wall of the adjacent building, letting in no view and very little light. It was a cell, a hiding place, a forgotten pocket of the city. "This will be our home for now," Arthur said, his voice echoing slightly in the bare room. "It's not much, but it's safe. The owner is a friend, a man who values his privacy and mine." Eleanor placed her small bag on the floor, the sound seeming impossibly loud. The reality of her situation crashed down on her. She was a prisoner here, locked away from the world with a man she barely knew, a man who had faked his own death. The initial shock had worn off, leaving behind a deep, trembling unease. She wrapped her arms around herself, feeling a sudden chill. "And what happens now?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "We just stay here, forever." Arthur turned to face her, and in the dim light of the single bare bulb, she saw the full weight of the burden he carried. He looked utterly exhausted. "Stay here until I can get the evidence I have to the right people without them, or Blackwood knowing," he said. "We wait, we watch, and we stay alive." He moved to the small kitchenette, filling a tin kettle with water from the tap. His movements were precise, economical, as if he were conserving energy for a battle yet to come. Eleanor watched him, this strange and dangerous man, who was now her reluctant guardian. He was a paradox of elegance and brutality, a gentleman's spy pulled from the pages of a dime-store novel. She was terrified of him, and of the world he had dragged her into. And yet, as he lit the small gas stove and set the kettle on to boil, she felt another, more complex emotion stirring beneath the fear, a reluctant fascination. Her life had been a quiet, predictable story, written in polite prose. Arthur Sterling was a chapter of stark, terrifying poetry. She didn't know if she would survive reading it, but she knew, with a certainty that both thrilled and frightened her, that she could never go back to the simple stories she had known before. In the heart of the sleeping city, surrounded by the faint, ticking sound of borrowed time, their dangerous pact had been sealed. The days in the clockmaker's apartment bled into one another, each one measured by the relentless, quiet ticking from the shop below. Their world had shrunk to the size of these few sparse rooms, a ship adrift in the vast, dangerous ocean of Chicago. For Eleanor, the initial shock had subsided, replaced by a strange, tense domesticity. She learned the rhythms of their confinement, the way Arthur would stand for hours at the grimy window, not looking at the brick wall, but past it, his mind clearly miles away, mapping strategies and calculating risks. She learned he drank his coffee black, that he rarely slept for more than a few hours at a time, and that beneath his cool, controlled exterior was a current of restless energy that never truly settled. They spoke in low tones, their conversations a tapestry woven from necessity and a slowly dawning curiosity. He taught her the basics of spycraft, how to observe a room, how to notice details that were out of place, how to walk without making a sound. In return, she offered him moments of quiet normalcy. She would read to him from a tattered copy of The Three Musketeers she had found on a dusty shelf, her soft, steady voice filling the silence. And for a little while, he would close his eyes, and the tension would ease from his shoulders. A fragile, unspoken truce grew between them, born from shared solitude and the constant, humming presence of danger. The fascination she felt for him was a dangerous, blooming flower in the barren landscape of their existence. One evening, nearly 2 weeks into their seclusion, Arthur returned from one of his rare, risky excursions into the city. He moved with a new urgency, his face set like granite. He spread a fresh copy of the Tribune on the small wooden table. "He's hosting a party," Arthur said, his finger tapping a column in the society pages, "an end of summer masquerade ball, at his estate on the North Shore. The entire city will be there, judges, senators, socialites, and all of Blackwood's key lieutenants." Eleanor read the announcement. It promised an evening of unparalleled extravagance, with music by the famed King Oliver's Creole Jazz Band. It was a world away from her reality, a fairy tale from a different planet. "What does it have to do with us?" "His study," Arthur replied, his grey eyes intense. "It's in the west wing of the mansion. That's where he keeps his real ledgers. Not the doctored books he shows his accountants, but the ones that detail every bribe, every shipment, every payoff. I've seen them once, but I was never able to get close enough to secure them. A party like this, it's the perfect cover. Everyone will be distracted. Security will be focused on the guests, not the house itself. It's my one chance to get what I need to end this for good." Eleanor's heart sank. "You're going to go, but it's a suicide mission. They'll recognize you." "Not if I'm wearing a mask," he countered, "and not if I have a beautiful, distracting partner on my arm who no one has ever seen before." The implication hit her with the force of a physical blow. "Me? No, I can't. I don't know how to be one of those people. I would be a liability. You are observant, Eleanor, and you are a quick study. And more importantly," he said, his voice softening almost imperceptibly, "you are the only person in the world I can trust." His words, meant to reassure, only tightened the knot of fear in her stomach. Trust was a heavy burden, but looking at the desperate resolve in his eyes, she knew she had no choice. To refuse was to condemn them both to this life in the shadows indefinitely. To agree was to walk directly into the lion's den. "All right," she heard herself say, the word thin but determined. "I'll do it." The transformation took 2 days. Arthur procured the items through his mysterious contacts, smuggling them into the apartment in unmarked boxes. First was the dress. When Eleanor pulled it from its tissue paper wrappings, she gasped. It was a creation of shimmering, midnight blue silk, covered in intricate beadwork that glittered like 1,000 captured stars. It was sleeveless, with a daringly low back and a hemline that would barely skim her knees. It was the antithesis of everything she had ever worn. Next came the shoes, delicate silver things with teardrop heels, and a feathered headband that would sit low on her brow. The most drastic change, however, was her hair. With a pair of sharp shears and a surprisingly steady hand, Arthur himself cut her long, mousy brown locks. He fashioned it into a chic, ear-length bob, the style of the modern woman. When it was done, he turned her to face the small, cracked mirror that hung on the wall. The woman who stared back was a stranger. Her eyes, accented with a touch of kohl Arthur had provided, seemed larger and deeper. Her neck, now exposed, looked long and elegant. The severe librarian had vanished, replaced by a sleek, sophisticated creature of the night. She looked beautiful. The thought was so foreign it made her blush. "There," Arthur said, his voice a low murmur from behind her. She met his eyes in the mirror. He wasn't looking at her reflection. He was looking at her, and his gaze held an unguarded warmth she had never seen before. No one will ever recognize Eleanor Vance. The night of the ball, a thick tension filled the small apartment. Dressed in a perfectly tailored tuxedo, a black silk mask covering the upper half of his face, Arthur Sterling looked every bit the aristocrat he was pretending to be. When Eleanor emerged in the blue dress, the beads whispering with her every movement, he fell silent. His eyes traveled over her, from the feathered band in her newly shorn hair to the silver shoes on her feet, and for a moment the mission, the danger, and Walter Blackwood all ceased to exist. There was only the man and the woman, standing in a room filled with ticking clocks. "You'll do more than distract them, Eleanor," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't hide. "You'll stop their hearts." He held out a delicate mask of silver filigree. "Are you ready?" She took a deep breath, her heart hammering against the fine silk of her dress. "No," she said honestly, "but let's go anyway." Blackwood's estate was a palace of light and sound on the shore of Lake Michigan. Cars Packards, Duesenbergs, Rolls-Royces lined the long sweeping driveway. Music and laughter spilled from the opened French doors, a wave of joyous decadence washing over the manicured lawns. As they stepped out of their hired car and mingled with the throng of masked guests, Eleanor felt a dizzying sense of unreality. Champagne flowed from fountains, women in jewel-toned dresses dripped with diamonds, and men in sharp tuxedos laughed with the careless confidence of the rich and powerful. "Stay close," Arthur murmured, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back. His touch was a small, solid anchor in the swirling sea of strangers. "Smile. Laugh at the jokes. Look like you belong here. I need to get the lay of the land. Find Blackwood." They found him holding court near the orchestra. A large, imposing man with a bulldog face and eyes as cold and gray as a winter lake. He wore a simple gold mask, but there was no mistaking the aura of absolute power that radiated from him. Clarence Gallo, his brutish enforcer, stood nearby, unmasked, his eyes constantly scanning the crowd. Eleanor's breath hitched, and she felt Arthur's hand tighten on her back, a silent message of reassurance. "He's distracted," Arthur whispered into her ear, his breath warm against her skin. "The study's on the second floor, last door on the left in the west wing. I need 15 minutes. Can you keep Gallo occupied? Talk to him, flatter him, spill a drink on him, I don't care. Just keep his eyes off the staircase." The thought of approaching the man from the alley, the man who had haunted her nightmares, sent a wave of icy terror through her. But then she looked at Arthur, at the grim determination in his masked face, and she nodded. She did it. With a courage she never knew she possessed, she approached the brutish gangster, feigning a stumble and spilling a drop of her ginger ale onto his sleeve. His initial glare of fury softened into a predatory leer as he took in her appearance. She engaged him in vapid, breathless chatter, playing the part of a dizzy flapper to perfection. All the while her heart pounded a frantic sauce against her ribs. She could feel his eyes roaming over her, and it took every ounce of her willpower not to shrink away. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Arthur detach from the crowd and slip toward the grand staircase. Just as her nerve was about to break, the orchestra transitioned from a force-paced Charleston to a slower, more romantic melody, a waltz. It was then that a new figure appeared at her side. "Mr. Gallo, I believe you are monopolizing the most enchanting woman at the party," a smooth voice said. It was Walter Blackwood. He turned his cold eyes to Eleanor, a flicker of appraisal in their depths. "Might I have this dance, mademoiselle?" It was a command, not a request. Trapped, Eleanor could only nod. Blackwood led her onto the floor, his hand firm on her back. As they began to move, Eleanor saw Arthur reappear at the top of the stairs. He had seen. A look of pure, cold fury crossed his face before his mask and his training hid it again. He descended the stairs and began moving toward them with a predatory grace. "You seem new to our little circle," Blackwood said, his voice a low rumble. "I make it my business to know every beautiful face in Chicago. I'm just visiting a friend," Eleanor replied, her voice miraculously steady. Suddenly, Arthur was there. "Walter, old man," he said, his voice smooth as velvet, affecting the careless drawl of the upper class. "Forgive my intrusion, but a man can't stand by and watch the belle of the ball be swept away. You must allow me to cut in." Blackwood's eyes narrowed slightly, studying Arthur's masked face. But the sheer audacity of the move, combined with Arthur's flawless performance, seemed to disarm him. With a curt nod, he released Eleanor. "Enjoy yourself," he said, before melting back into the crowd. Arthur's arms went around her, pulling her close. "Are you all right?" he murmured, his voice tight with a barely controlled rage. "I'm fine," she breathed, relief washing over her as he swept her into the rhythm of the waltz. And then there was only the music. The world of masks, lies, and danger fell away. There was only the solid strength of his arms around her, the whisper of her beaded dress against his trousers, the hypnotic spinning lights of the chandeliers above. He led her effortlessly, their bodies moving as one. In her sensible shoes, Eleanor was clumsy, but in these silver heels guided by his hand, she was weightless. She tilted her head back to look at him, at the strong line of his jaw beneath his mask, at the intensity in his eyes. Dud, got it," he whispered, so low she barely heard him. "A small, coated ledger. It's enough." The triumph in his voice was a spark of warmth in the cold fear of the evening. They had done it. They had won. The dance became a silent celebration, a secret victory shared between two people in a room full of enemies. The music swelled, and he pulled her closer still, until she could feel the steady beat of his heart against her own. The chemistry that had simmered between them in the cramped apartment now blazed in the open, a fire fueled by adrenaline and a desire that could no longer be denied. When the music ended, he didn't let her go. He kept a firm hold of her hand and led her from the dance floor, through an open set of French doors, and into the cool, fragrant air of the moonlit gardens. They walked in silence, past manicured rose bushes and ornate fountains, until they were hidden from the house by a tall, sculpted hedge. He turned to her, his back to the moonlight, his face in shadow. He reached up with one hand and gently removed her silver mask. Then he took off his own. In the pale light, his face was etched with a raw vulnerability she had never seen before. "You were magnificent," he said, his voice hoarse. "You were braver than any soldier I have ever known." "I was terrified," she confessed. "I know," he said softly. "That's what makes it bravery." He raised her hand and cupped her cheek, his thumb gently stroking her skin. The gesture was so tender, so at odds with the violence and deception that defined their lives, that it made her throat ache. He leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't. She couldn't. His lips met hers, and it was not a gentle kiss. It was a kiss of desperation and relief, of gratitude, and a deep, aching need. It was a confirmation of everything that had been left unsaid in the ticking silence of their hiding place. It was the taste of danger and the promise of a dawn they might just live to see. For a breathtaking, timeless moment, they were not a spy and a witness. They were just a man and a woman, finding a flicker of truth in a world of lies. The journey back from the Blackwood estate was a study in hushed intimacy. The raucous jazz and shimmering lights of the party faded into a distant memory, leaving only the quiet hum of the Ford's engine and the slick sound of its tires on the damp city streets. Eleanor sat beside Arthur, the midnight blue dress a cool whisper against her skin. She was acutely aware of the space between them, a space that was no longer a chasm of uncertainty, but a fragile territory charged with the lingering electricity of their kiss. The stolen moment in the garden had changed everything. It had been a spark in the darkness, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had been forged in their shared confinement. She could still feel the phantom pressure of his lips on hers, a warmth that defied the cool night air. Arthur drove with his customary focus, but his silence was different now. It was no longer the guarded quiet of a spy, but the thoughtful quiet of a man wrestling with a new, unplanned complication. When he glanced at her, his eyes, even in the fleeting glow of the street lamps, held a softness that hadn't been there before. The wall between them had been breached. Back in the sanctuary of the clockmaker's apartment, the stark reality of their situation did little to dispel the magic. Arthur carefully locked the door behind them, the heavy thud of the bolt sounding less like a prison sentence and more like the world being shut out, leaving them safe in their private bubble. "You should get some rest," he said, his voice low. He didn't move away, but stood before her, his gaze tracing the lines of her face as if memorizing them. "And you?" she asked softly. "I have work to do," he said, gesturing to the small leather-bound ledger he had placed on the table. "This is our way out, Eleanor. I need to understand what's inside." She nodded, a pang of disappointment mingling with her understanding. She had foolishly hoped, just for a moment, that the night might end differently, that the man who had kissed her with such desperate passion might stay with her, just for a little while. But Arthur Sterling was a man on a mission, and the mission always came first. She watched him shrug off his tuxedo jacket, roll up his sleeves, and sit down at the table under the harsh light of the single bulb. The romantic hero from the garden was gone, replaced once more by the focused, dangerous agent. The following days saw a subtle but definite shift in their dynamic. Arthur became more consumed, his focus narrowed entirely on the coded entries in Blackwood's ledger. He spent hours hunched over the table, muttering to himself, scribbling notes on scraps of paper. He grew more distant, the wall between them slowly being rebuilt, bricked by painful brick. He was still protective, his vigilance heightened. He would stop his work at the slightest unfamiliar sound from the street below, his body instantly tense, his hand drifting to the revolver he now kept tucked into the waistband of his trousers. His increased caution was not unfounded. One afternoon, as Eleanor stared out the grimy window at the sliver of alley she could see, she spotted them, two men in dark coats and fedoras, standing on the corner opposite her old apartment building. They weren't doing anything, just smoking cigarettes and watching. But they watched with a predatory stillness that made her blood run cold. They were Blackwood's men. Her past was no longer a safe and distant country. It was a hunting ground, she told Arthur, her voice a trembling whisper. He came to stand beside her, his body a warm, solid shield between her and the window. He watched the men for a long, silent moment, his jaw tight. "They know someone was there," he said, his voice grim. "They are casting a net. We were right to leave." He turned to her, placing his hands on her shoulders. His touch was meant to be reassuring, but it felt different now, less like a caress and more like a restraint. "This is why I must finish this. It's more important than ever that you stay here. You do not leave this room, for any reason, do you understand?" She nodded, a lump forming in her throat. She understood the logic, but her heart felt the sting of his command. She was his prisoner again, not his partner. The shared victory of the ball, the shared intimacy of the kiss, felt like a dream she was waking from. Was that all she was to him? A liability to be protected, a piece on his chessboard to be kept safe until the end of the game. The doubt, once planted, began to grow, its roots wrapping around her heart. She needed to understand him, to understand the man behind the masks of the socialite and the spy. That evening, while he had finally succumbed to an exhausted sleep in the armchair, his revolver resting on the table beside the coded ledger, she found herself drawn to his valise. It was a simple leather bag he kept packed by the door, his one connection to a life outside these walls, always ready to flee. She told herself she was just looking for a book, for anything to distract her from the ticking clocks and her own circling thoughts. It was a lie. She was looking for him. Her fingers brushed against a hard-covered book, not a novel, but a journal beneath it, a bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. It felt like a profound violation of his privacy, but the need to know, to understand the secret he held so close to his chest, was a hunger she could no longer ignore. With trembling hands, she untied the ribbon. The letters were old, the paper soft and thin with age, the ink faded to a soft sepia. They were written in an elegant, feminine hand. The first one she opened was addressed to my dearest James. It spoke of love, of shared dreams, of a future together. It was signed, "With all my heart, your Evelyn." Eleanor frowned. "James? Evelyn?" She continued to read, her confusion growing. The letters painted a portrait of a deep and passionate love affair, but there was a shadow in the words, a man who disapproved of their Evelyn's older, powerful brother, a man who controlled the family fortune and her future, a man named Walter Blackwood. Her breath caught. She frantically scanned the letters, her heart beginning to pound a heavy, sickening rhythm. Then she found the last one. It was dated 15 years prior. The handwriting was frantic, blotted with what could have been tears. Evelyn wrote of a terrible argument, of her brother's threats, of his decision to send her away, to marry her off to a business partner in Europe to keep her away from James. "He is a monster, my love," she had written. "He sees everything as a transaction, even my heart. But I will not go. I will find a way for us to be together. Meet me at our place by the lake. We will run away tonight. If you love me, James, you will be there." Tucked into the last letter was a newspaper clipping, yellowed and brittle with age. The headline was stark: "Tragic accident on North Shore. Young heiress Evelyn Blackwood drowns." The article reported that the beautiful younger sister of philanthropist Walter Blackwood had apparently fallen from her family's private pier during a late-night stroll and drowned. Her fiancé had mentioned briefly a promising young businessman named James Sterling had been devastated by the loss. James Sterling, Arthur's father. The air rushed from Eleanor's lungs. It was as if she had been punched. The entire carefully constructed narrative Arthur had given her crumbled into dust, revealing the raw, ugly truth beneath. This wasn't a job, not entirely. This was a vendetta, a 15-year-old quest for revenge, cloaked in the respectable mantle of federal justice. Evelyn Blackwood hadn't accidentally fallen. She had been on her way to elope with his father, and her brother, the man who saw his sister as a transaction, had stood in her way. Every moment they had shared, every word he had spoken, was cast in a new, sinister light. His need for her silence, his protection, the mission itself, was it all just a means to an end? Was she just a tool he had found in an alleyway, a key to unlock his personal vengeance? The kiss in the garden, which had felt so real, so true, now felt like a calculated manipulation, a way to ensure her loyalty, to keep his asset compliant. A cold, bitter anger, the likes of which she had never felt before, rose up inside her, choking the grief and fear. She carefully retied the ribbon, placed the letters back in the valise, and sat down in the chair opposite him, the small wooden table, a battlefield between them. She waited. When he finally stirred, blinking the sleep from his eyes, he saw her. He saw the look on her face, the cold fury in her eyes, and he knew instantly that something was wrong. "Eleanor, what is it?" She didn't answer. She simply slid the yellowed newspaper clipping across the table. He froze. His gaze dropped to the clipping, and every ounce of color drained from his face. The mask of control he wore so perfectly shattered, and for a fleeting second she saw the raw, 15-year-old pain beneath. He looked up at her, his gray eyes filled with a desperate, hunted expression. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Does it matter?" she replied, her own voice dangerously quiet, devoid of the warmth he was used to. "This isn't just a mission, is it, Arthur? You've been lying to me from the very beginning." "I didn't lie," he said, his voice regaining some of its strength, some of its defensiveness. "Everything I told you about my work, about the danger, is true." "You omitted the truth," she shot back, standing up, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "You omitted the one thing that truly matters. This is about revenge for your father, for what Blackwood did to Evelyn. This is personal. You've had this planned for years, haven't you?" The questions poured out of her, fueled by a profound sense of betrayal. "And me? What was I? A happy accident? A convenient witness you could use to get closer to your goal? Tell me, Arthur, the ball, the dance, that kiss, was any of it real? Or was it just part of the mission?" He stood up to face her, his expression torn. "Eleanor, you have to understand." "No," she cried, taking a step back as he moved toward her. "I understand perfectly. You needed my silence, and then you needed a partner, so you used me. You told me just enough of the truth to keep me compliant. You let me believe I was helping you serve justice, when all along I was just helping you settle a family score." The trust between them, so new and so fragile, lay shattered on the floor. In the small, sparse room, surrounded by the incessant ticking of the clocks below, they were no longer partners. They were a spy with a secret vendetta, and a woman who had seen the truth he had tried so desperately to hide. And outside, in the city that never slept, Walter Blackwood's net was closing in. The silence that fell between them was heavier and more suffocating than any they had shared in their confinement. It was silence, filled with the ghosts of unspoken words, fractured trust, and the bitter taste of betrayal. For 2 days they coexisted in the small apartment, like strangers trapped on a lifeboat, the vast, cold ocean of their conflict stretching between them. Arthur tried to speak, to bridge the gap, but Eleanor's heart had armored itself against him. She met his attempts with a cool, polite distance that was more painful than any shouted accusation. She would look at him, and he could see the question she no longer bothered to ask. "What part of you is real?" His focus on the ledger became a desperate, frantic thing. It was no longer just a mission or a quest for vengeance. It was the only path to absolution. It was the only way to prove to her, and perhaps to himself, that the cause was just, even if his methods had been born from a lie of omission. He worked without sleep, fueled by black coffee and annoying guilt. He was close, so close, to deciphering the final key list of drop points and shipping manifest that would incriminate Blackwood beyond any doubt. On the third morning, he knew he couldn't delay any longer. He had to deliver a preliminary report to his contact, a coded message that needed to be left at a secured dead drop a dozen blocks away. The risk was enormous, but the risk of inaction was greater. "I have to go out," he announced to the tense quiet of the room. "It won't take more than an hour. I'll be back before noon." Eleanor was sitting by the window, a book open in her lap. Though she hadn't turned a page in an hour, she didn't look at him. "You do what you have to do, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice flat. The use of his formal name was a deliberate, sharp twist of the knife. A muscle twitched in his jaw. "Eleanor, please. When I get back we will talk. I will tell you everything. Oh, the whole truth. I promise." She finally looked up, her eyes clear and cold. "The truth is a currency you spent a long time ago. Just be careful." His name was on her lips, a desperate plea, but he swallowed it down. He couldn't force her to trust him again. He could only earn it. With a final, pained look, he slipped out of the apartment, the grandfather clock swinging silently shut behind him, leaving her alone with the ticking of time. Eleanor sat in the silence, the book feeling heavy in her hands. Was her anger just? Yes, but beneath the anger, a current of deep, aching sorrow flowed. She missed the man she thought he was. She missed the easy camaraderie, the shared danger that had felt like a partnership. Had she been a fool to believe in it, to believe in that kiss? Her thoughts were interrupted by a sound from the shop below. Not the familiar creak of the old building, but a sharp, splintering crack. The sound of a door being forced. Her blood turned to ice. She froze, every nerve ending screaming. It wasn't Arthur. He had a key. He was silent. This was loud, brutal. Heavy footsteps echoed on the floorboards of the clog shop. They were not wandering. They were searching. Panic seized her. She scrambled away from the window, her mind racing through Arthur's lessons. Be invisible. Be silent. She looked desperately around the small apartment. There was nowhere to hide. The wardrobe was too shallow, the bed too low to the ground. The footsteps stopped directly below. Then came a new sound, a metallic grinding, the sound of something being cried open. The clock. They knew about the clock. In that moment, terror gave way to a cold, stark clarity. This was not a random raid. They had come for her. Arthur's protection was gone. She was alone. Her eyes darted to the table, to the revolver he had so carelessly left behind in his haste and emotional turmoil. Her hand trembled as she picked it up. It was heavy, alien, a piece of his world she'd never wanted to touch. The grandfather clock swung open with a groan. Heavy footsteps began to ascend the hidden staircase. She backed away until she was pressed against the far wall, the gun held in both shaking hands, pointed at the door. The doorknob began to turn. The door swung inward, and the first man to step through was not some nameless thug. It was Clarence Gallo. His brutish face split into a cruel, triumphant grin when he saw her. "Well, well, look what we have here," he sneered, his eyes flicking to the gun in her hands. "A little songbird, and she thinks she can bite." Behind him, Walter Blackwood himself stepped into the room, his presence seeming to suck all the air out. He was dressed in an immaculate suit, his cold eyes taking in the sparse apartment with disdain before they settled on her. He looked amused. "Put the gun down, my dear," Blackwood said, his voice deceptively calm. "You and I both know you won't use it. You're not the type." He was right. Her hands trembled, her finger frozen on the trigger. She was a librarian, not a killer. With a sob of frustration, she let the gun clatter to the floor. Gallo moved with surprising speed, grabbing her arms and wrenching them behind her back, tying her wrists with a rough piece of rope. "A smart girl," Blackwood said, picking up the revolver from the floor and tucking it into his coat. "I must admit you were difficult to find, but the little French shopkeeper who sold your hair comb was very cooperative. After some persuasion, he remembered you, the quiet girl from the bookstore." He walked over to the table and picked up Arthur's ledger. He flipped through it, a dark smile playing on his lips. "And it seems you've been keeping my property for me. Sterling is a sentimental fool after all." He couldn't resist coming back for his father's work. The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow. his father's work. "Now," Blackwood said, his tone turning to cold steel, "we're going to wait for our ghost to return. And you, my dear, are going to be the bait in our trap." When Arthur returned, an hour later, the silence that greeted him was wrong. It was a dead, empty silence. "Eleanor," he called out, a knot of dread tightening in his stomach. He pushed open the door to the apartment and stopped dead. The room was empty. The ledger was gone, and on the center of the table, where the ledger had been, was a single playing card, the King of Spades. Beneath it, a single, brutal address was scrawled on a piece of paper: Pier 4, Southside Warehouses. The world tilted on its axis. His carefully constructed plans, his 15 years of waiting, all of it turned to ash in his mouth. He had failed. He had left her alone, and Blackwood had taken her. The cold, calculating agent inside him evaporated, burned away by a white-hot wave of pure, unadulterated rage. This was no longer about ledgers or justice, or even revenge for his father. It was about Eleanor. He had dragged her into this hell, and he would tear the city down to get her back. The warehouse on Pier 4 was a cavernous, skeletal structure, smelling of salt, creosote, and decay. Moonlight streamed through the high, grimy windows, cutting sharp beams through the dusty air and casting long, distorted shadows among the towering stacks of crates. In the center of the vast space, Eleanor was tied to a wooden chair. Blackwood stood before her, Gallo at his side, 2 other thugs lurking in the shadows. "He will come," Blackwood said confidently. "For men like Sterling, honor and sentiment are fatal flaws. He thinks he's a knight coming to save the damsel. It's pathetic." "You're wrong," Eleanor said, her voice shaking but defiant. She had been terrified, but listening to Blackwood's arrogant monologue, a new emotion was taking root, a cold, simmering anger. "He's coming to stop you." A slow, deliberate footstep echoed from the far end of the warehouse. A figure emerged from the deepest shadows, stepping into a beam of moonlight. It was Arthur. He was alone, his hands empty and held slightly away from his body. His face was a pale, emotionless mask, but his eyes were burning with a cold fire that was aimed directly at Blackwood. "Let her go, Blackwood," Arthur said, his voice calm, yet carrying the deadly weight of a promise. "This is between you and me. It always has been." Blackwood laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that echoed in the cavernous space. "Ah, the ghost appears. I knew you couldn't resist. You have your father's foolish heart, Arthur. Did you know he begged for his life just before my men put him in the lake? Just like my sister begged me not to ruin her life. Begging is so undignified." The taunt was meant to break him, but Arthur's expression didn't change. "My father was a better man than you will ever be, and Evelyn loved him. You couldn't stand that, could you? You couldn't control her love, so you took it from the world. She was a Blackwood. Her duty was to her family, to me." Blackwood roared, his composure finally cracking. "Not to some penniless Sterling with romantic notions." While the 2 men were locked in their battle of wills, Eleanor was working. Arthur had taught her to observe. She saw the frayed edge of the rope around her right wrist. She saw the rusty nail protruding from the side of the crate just behind her chair. She saw a heavy block and tackle hanging from a chain directly above Gallo. It was a long shot. It was everything. "You're a monster," Eleanor spat at Blackwood, deliberately drawing his attention. "You destroy everything you can't own." Her voice, sharp and defiant, was the diversion. As Blackwood and Gallo turned to her, momentarily distracted, Arthur moved. He dove behind a stack of crates as one of the thugs opened fire, the gunshot deafening in the enclosed space. At the same instant, Eleanor threw all her weight backward and to the side. The chair teetered, and with a surge of adrenaline, she slammed her bound wrists against the rusty nail. The frayed rope snapped. Her hands were free. As Gallo lunged for her, she shoved the heavy wooden chair directly into his path, sending him stumbling sideways. Then she scrambled for the one thing she could reach, a thick, heavy length of rope tied to the wall, the release for the block and tackle. She pulled with all her might. Above Gallo, the heavy iron hook and pulley plunged downward, striking him on the shoulder with a sickening thud. He crumpled to the ground, howling in pain. The world exploded into chaos. The second thug fired wildly into the shadows where Arthur had disappeared. Eleanor scrambled for cover. Blackwood, seeing his advantage lost, pulled Arthur's revolver from his coat. He didn't aim at the shadows. He aimed directly at Eleanor. "No more loose ends," he snarled. He fired. But Arthur was faster. A single, sharp crack echoed from the darkness. It was not Blackwood's gun. Blackwood staggered, a look of stunned surprise on his face. The revolver fell from his hand. He looked down at the dark, spreading stain on his pristine white shirt, then looked up at Arthur, who now stood in the open, a second, smaller pistol in his hand. "This is for Eveling," Arthur said, his voice low and devoid of all emotion. Walter Blackwood crumpled to the floor, the great emperor of the shadows, reduced to nothing. Silence fell, absolute and profound. It was over. From the distance, the faint, wailing sound of police sirens grew steadily closer. Arthur must have called them. He had planned for this. He walked slowly out of the shadows, his gun held loosely at his side. He didn't look at the bodies of the men he had vanquished. His eyes were only for Eleanor. He rushed to her side, his hands hovering over her, as if afraid to touch her, afraid she might break. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice raw. She shook her head, her body trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline and terror. He reached out and, with gentle fingers, untied the last of the rope from her wrists. Their eyes met in the dusty, moonlit chaos. The anger, the betrayal, the lies, it was all there in the space between them. But there was something else now, something new and fragile, forged in the crucible of this violence. It was a shared survival. It was a truth, finally paid for in blood. He had come back for her. He had risked everything, and in the ruins of their deceptions, that was the only fact that mattered. The wail of the sirens grew from a distant cry to a deafening scream, their flashing red lights painting the cavernous warehouse in frantic, rhythmic strokes of crimson. The aftermath of the violence was a tableau of surreal stillness. Walter Blackwood, the untouchable emperor, was a fallen king on a concrete throne. His men were either incapacitated or surrendering to the uniformed officers now swarming the pier. Arthur didn't spare them a glance. His entire universe had contracted to the small space around Eleanor. He gently chafed her wrists where the ropes had been, his touch both a question and an apology. Dust and grime smudged her cheek. Her beautiful flapper bob was disheveled, and her eyes were wide with shock. But she was alive. She was breathing. That was the only victory that mattered. "The police," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "They'll have questions. They'll see you." "I made an anonymous call before I came here," he said, his voice low and urgent. "My contact in the department knows part of the story. Enough to put Blackwood's empire away for good, with the ledger and his own confession tonight. But Arthur Sterling is still officially a dead man. We can't be here when the dust settles." He helped her to her feet, his arms securely around her waist, supporting her as the last of the adrenaline gave way to a bone-deep exhaustion. He led her away from the chaos, through a side door, and back into the cool, indifferent night. They moved through the city's shadowed veins, two ghosts slipping away from the scene of their own resurrection, leaving the law to piece together the narrative they had created. The clockmaker's shop was no longer a sanctuary. It felt tainted, violated, but it was the only place they could go. As the grandfather clock clicked shut behind them, sealing them once more in its quiet heart, the tension that had been held at bay by the fight for survival came rushing back in. They were safe, but they were not whole. Arthur lit a single lamp, casting a soft, golden glow over the small apartment. He guided Eleanor to a chair and then retrieved a first aid kit, his movements deliberate and gentle. He knelt before her, cleaning the raw, chafed skin on her wrists and applying a soothing salve. He worked in silence, his head bowed, his focus entirely on his task. The intimacy of the gesture was a stark contrast to the chasm of betrayal that still lay between them. When he finished, he didn't move away. He remained kneeling before her, his hands resting on his knees, and looked up at her. The masks were all gone, the spy, the socialite, the avenger. All that was left was a man, stripped bare, his guilt and regret raw in his grey eyes. His father's work, Eleanor said, her voice quiet but steady. It wasn't a question. It was the piece of the puzzle she had been missing. Arthur nodded, his gaze dropping to the floor. My father, James, was the first one to get close to Blackwood. He was a junior agent for the Treasury, posing as a businessman. He met Evelyn, and what started as part of his cover became real. He fell in love with her. He was going to leave the service, take her away, and start a new life. He wanted out. But Blackwood found out who he was. The night Evelyn died, my father was there, across the lake, waiting for her. He saw Blackwood's men on the pier. He knew it wasn't an accident. He finally looked at her, his expression haunted. Blackwood framed him, planted evidence that my father had been embezzling from his company. He used his influence to ruin him, to discredit him. No one would believe his story about Evelyn being murdered. The official investigation was a sham. It broke him. He spent the rest of his life, obsessed, gathering every scrap of information he could, trying to prove what Blackwood had done. The mission, it became my inheritance when he passed away. I used his notes to get inside, to finish what he started. His confession was a river of long-held pain, washing away the last of the lies. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, the anger in her voice now softened by a deep, aching sorrow for the man before her, and for the father he had lost. "Because I was ashamed," he admitted, his voice cracking with a vulnerability she had never heard. "I was ashamed that my quest for justice was so tangled up in a personal vendetta. I told myself it was to protect you, to keep you from being emotionally involved. But that was a lie. I was protecting myself. If I kept you at a distance, if you were just a witness I had to manage, I wouldn't have to face what this obsession had turned me into. And then, in this room at that party, in the garden, you weren't a witness anymore. You were." Eleanor, and I was terrified of what it meant, and terrified of dragging you down with me. He finally stood, creating a space between them, a space for her to make a choice. "What Blackwood's man told you was true. I have resources. I can create a new life for you, anywhere you want to go. A new name, a quiet town, a bookstore of your very own. You can have your old life back, a safe life. You'll never have to see me or this world again. I can give you that." He was offering her an escape from him. Eleanor looked at this complicated, broken, and brave man. The man who had lied to her, and the man who had risked his life for her. She thought of her old life, of the quiet, predictable safety of the Quill and Chronicle. It had been a peaceful existence, but she realized now it had been a life half-lived, a story read rather than written. She had been safe in her cocoon, but she'd never known what it was to fly. Arthur had torn her world apart, but in the wreckage, he had shown her a strength and a courage she never knew she possessed. He had shown her what it felt like to be truly alive. To go back now would be a different kind of death. Slowly she stood and walked toward him, closing the distance he had created. She stopped directly in front of him and reached up, her fingers gently touching his cheek. He flinched, as if expecting a blow, but then leaned into her touch, his eyes closing for a brief moment. "I don't want a safe life, Arthur," she said softly. "I want a real one, with you." Relief washed over his features, so profound it was as if a physical weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her against him, burying his face in her hair. It was not a kiss of passion, but something deeper, a homecoming. It was an embrace of forgiveness, of acceptance, of two broken pieces fitting together to make a fragile whole. "I don't know what our future looks like," he murmured against her hair. "It won't be easy. Nothing worth having ever is," she replied, her voice muffled against his chest. "What's our first chapter?" A genuine smile, the first she had seen in days, touched his lips. "I think our first chapter is leaving Chicago in the rearview mirror, before the sun rose." Casting its first pale rosy fingers over the steel and stone of the city, they were gone. They slipped out of the clock shop for the last time, leaving the ghosts of their past behind. The Ford T was waiting, a humble chariot for their great escape. Eleanor climbed in beside him, her small valise at her feet. She was no longer the mousy librarian who had taken a fearful shortcut through an alley. She was a survivor, a co-conspirator, a woman who had faced down monsters and chosen love in the aftermath. Arthur started the engine, and they pulled away from the curb, driving east, toward the dawn. As the sprawling, wounded city grew smaller behind them, Eleanor looked at the man beside her. His face, illuminated by the nascent light of a new day, was no longer a mask of secrets, but a map of a future she was ready to explore. "Where are we going?" she asked, a thrill of pure, unadulterated adventure bubbling up inside her. He reached over and took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers, a silent, binding promise. "Somewhere," he said, his gray eyes fixed on the open road ahead. "We can write our own story. True love is not measured by the absence of secrets, but by the courage to face them together. The past can create wounds, but it is in the choice to forgive and build a new truth that a love capable of conquering any shadow is truly born." If this story touched your heart, subscribe for more romances.